Hi, my name is Peter Evans and I'm a photographer and photography tutor based in southwest France. In this video I'm going to talk to you about shooting contre-jour. I'll explain what it means as opposed to what many photographers think it means, and to illustrate my take on the style I'll be showing you over 40 example images from plants, birds and insects through landscapes and townscapes to portraits and full body shots. So let's get started, shall we? Photographing contre-jour is a style of photography I love, and I hope that by the end of this tutorial you'll want to go out, experiment and begin to love it too. It'll bring a whole new dynamic to your photography, giving your images real impact. It'll bring you satisfaction too, because it's challenging, and when you get it right, trust me, it feels good.
I feel good. I knew that I would now.
There are three main challenges to shooting contre-jour successfully: lighting, exposure and post-processing. And the challenges increase when you start shooting portraits, be they full body shots like these or headshots like these. And because of that, I'm first going to deal with the overall concept of shooting landscapes, townscapes and nature contre-jour. Looking at the photographs I've shown you so far, some of you may have been a bit confused, thinking, hang on a minute, those aren't what I thought were contre-jour images. And if you did, it's because the term contre-jour is widely misunderstood, given the number of images of silhouettes at sunrise and sunset I've seen on the internet which are being used to illustrate it. These are 4 of mine, 3 shot at sunset and 1 at sunrise. I'm quite proud of the shot of the raptor hovering above the Ghanaian jungle, but the other 3 are not amongst my favourite contre-jour shots. In all honesty, for me, they're a bit cliched. Having said that, they are definitely contre-jour, as are the myriad photographs out there that are just like them. So, what's the problem, you might ask? Why am I saying that the term is misunderstood? Well, shooting contre-jour is much more than shooting just silhouettes at sunset. The misunderstanding arises because too many photographers have been led to believe that the term contre-jour means shooting into the sun. It doesn't. Trust me, contre-jour is a French term, and because I speak French, I know exactly what it means. The French word contre means against, and the word jour, although its most widely understood translation is day, can also mean daylight or simply light. Therefore, contre-jour means against the light, not into the sun. So, simply put, a contre-jour photograph is one which is backlit, no matter the source of the light. Et voila, there you have it. The myth is dispelled, the misinformation corrected. Later on, I'll run a slideshow of all the images I'm showing you in this video, together with a few others, including the full image from which the video's thumbnail was made. And I'll also add the shooting data and lighting details for each one so that you can see how the photographs were achieved. In practice, for me, shooting contre-jour, or as we've established, against the light, means shooting a subject which is lit by a strong light source positioned about 150 degrees or more behind the point of interest. If you don't know what I mean by point of interest, you'll find the answer in my video on the subject of composition, and I've provided a link to that in the description below. But for the purposes of this tutorial, you can consider the point of interest as your subject. A less technical explanation is to say that if the front element of your lens is capable of being hit directly by the light source, then you're shooting contre-jour. I use the words capable of deliberately because in order to get a crisp, contrasty, attractive image, you must prevent that light source from shining directly onto the front element of the lens. If your lens is not shaded from the light source in some way, then 95% of the time you're going to have a major problem. Here's what that problem looks like in practical terms. Note how the images look washed out and lacking in detail. This is caused by a phenomenon known as flare. In that latter image, we can see the flare in this area. Plus, you risk getting the artifact shown here. This second phenomenon is known as ghosting. Both phenomena are caused by the rays from the light source entering the lens and then being reflected off the different surfaces of the lens internal elements before reaching the sensor. 4% of the time, however, it'll be fine. In fact, with some thought and a bit of luck, you can shoot straight at the light source and create an image like this. And 1% of the time, you may actually want flare and ghosting in your image, just for the hell of it. So, how do you stop rays from a light source ahead of you from hitting that front element? Well, the first and most obvious answer is to use a lens hood. Except for macro work, I always use a lens hood. Always, without exception. Even indoors. Why? Well, not only for the reason I just stated, but also because if I accidentally smack the camera against something, it's the lens hood that takes the knock, never the lens itself. A deep lens hood, like this one, will do a great job shading the lens from extraneous light. However, if you're shooting wide, then the lens will have a petal style hood, like this, which is pretty much useless for shading the lens when you're shooting Contre-Jour. So, if your lens hood is shallow and can't do the job, or you're using a compact camera or a phone, then an alternative solution could be to use something in your field of view to block the sun, like this. Or, if a portrait, even your subject, like this. If that's not possible, then find some shade and shoot from there. Or simply hold your hand or a piece of card or a magazine or anything above the lens to shade it. With a small camera, like my Sony RX100, or a phone, that's doable. But with a DSLR or mirrorless camera, it's more difficult, and you're probably going to need to use a tripod or rest the camera on a secure, flat surface, or you can ask someone else to shade the lens for you. Now, just before I move on to talk about exposure, I want to add one word of warning, and that relates to the use of protective filters. Now, I'm not going to enter the contentious debate as to whether protective filters are a good thing or a bad thing. Personally, except in adverse conditions like sea spray, for example, I don't use them because my lens hoods are my protection. But if you use them, that's perfectly fine. In all honesty, in the vast majority of cases, using one will have absolutely no detrimental effect on your image, except that is when you're shooting Contre-Jour. I say that because placing a protective filter in front of the lens introduces another glass surface, often of much lower quality than the glass in the lens itself, which can then cause light scatter when shooting against the light, making the flare and ghosting issue worse. So if you're used to fixing a protective filter to your lens, then for any Contre-Jour shots, especially where the lens is unshaded like this one, I strongly recommend that you remove it. Incidentally, the sun ray effect here is not created by any special filter or Photoshop tool, it's created by the blades of the diaphragm in the lens. Okay, so now we've dealt with the challenge of keeping extraneous light away from the lens's front element, we'll take a look at our second challenge, which is exposure. Under normal circumstances, I work to the maxim, expose for the highlights and let the shadows take care of themselves. So I'm usually wanting my histogram to finish just in the bottom right corner of the graph box, what's known as exposing to the right, or ETTR, as in this typical example. This ensures that I retain important detail in my highlights. The shadows I can sort out later on the computer. However, that's not going to be possible for many Contre-Jour shots because of the very nature of the style. So your histogram will often look more like this. Actually, let's take a look at a real-life example. Here's an image that I've shown you before, but this time you're seeing it just as I saw it on my camera screen after I shot it, together with its histogram. Adjusting exposure and exposing to the right to deal with the extreme blown highlights in a situation like this just won't work. A, because it's the sun that's causing the worst of them, so there is no detail to capture in the first place, and B, doing so would lose all the detail in the shadows. So remember Wilde's quote, "Rules are for the obedience of fools and the guidance of wise men," and always use exposing to the right as guidance rather than something to be adhered to religiously. Every time I take a shot in a new scenario, Contre-Jour or not, I check the histogram and ask myself these three questions. Is this overexposed? i.e., is the graph crashing into the right-hand edge of the graph box? And if yes, then I ask myself, where is it overexposed? And I check the highlight blinkies. And then I ask myself, do I care? If I don't care, because the overexposed area is the sun, or a specular highlight, or part of a cloud, or something else that's unimportant, as it was in that image we just looked at, then that's it. Nothing else needs to be done. Move on, take the next shot. If I do care, it will be because the blown highlights have destroyed detail in areas where I need detail, in which case I switch to manual and I make the necessary exposure adjustments. Switching to manual is just my own preferred way of working, ingrained over many years. I don't use exposure compensation because once it's set, it stays set until you reset it, or at least on my cameras anyway. And back in the early days of my shooting digital, that caused me more than one or two problems, I can tell you. So, because judging the exposure that you're going to need for a Contre-Jour shot is tricky, when you first start out using this style, I recommend that you shoot in aperture priority and then bracket your shot. A couple of stops under and a couple over. If your camera can do automatic bracketing, setting it up and doing that way would be ideal. Just don't forget to reset bracketing to 0 and turn off high-speed continuous shooting when you finish the shoot. But of course, if you just want to set your own exposure settings and experiment, checking your screen after each shot, then that's fine. In fact, it's a good way to learn. On that note, I'm always telling my students never judge your exposure just by looking at the image on your camera's screen. Always use the histogram. But, as I've just said, when shooting Contre-Jour, that's often not possible. And when it's not, then I always examine the image on my camera's screen. However, because of the very nature of the light conditions, it's almost impossible to see the image clearly enough to make a proper judgment, which is why, when I'm shooting outdoors, I always have one of these Hoodman loops hanging around my neck. They're not cheap, but to me, this little device is worth every cent. It's like looking at your computer screen in a darkened room. At the start of this video, I said that shooting Contre-Jour images like this, for example, was challenging. Shooting full-length people and close-up portraits Contre-Jour, like these full body and headshots, is even more challenging. Why? Because, by definition, the details of the person you're photographing are going to be in deep shadow. So it's a situation where you just cannot let the shadows take care of themselves. You need to supply some light to the front of your subject. This could be achieved by using a reflector. The problem is that reflectors need either a stand or an assistant, because holding one yourself while shooting is something you really don't want to try. And messing around with a stand when shooting in a busy urban area isn't really practical. So the solution I use is fill flash. That's not me in the photo, by the way. The big advantage of using a flash to illuminate your subject is that it's very controllable. I'm a Nikon user, and Nikon call their fill flash feature balanced lighting, which is a well-chosen description. You're using the flash to set up a pleasing balance of light on your subject relative to that bright background. The key to using fill flash is to control it so that only another photographer would know that it's being used. If you see harsh shadows caused by the flash, like in this extreme example, then you've overcooked it. I'm not criticizing this photograph, by the way, because the very strong flash effect was presumably deliberate. But under normal fill flash conditions, those heavy shadows I've ringed in red are the last thing you want. To help achieve softer shadows, rather than the type of small diffuser shown here, I recommend that you use a large one like this. I have a similar one that I bought in a photography shop in Rome. It does a great job and it folds flat and packs away really nicely. I've used it in all the head and body shots you see in this video. And lastly, the added advantage of using flash to light your shadows is that it places nice catch lights in your subject's eyes. By the way, because your flash can't cycle that quickly, rapid automatic bracketing isn't going to be an option when shooting portraits, which is another reason why they are so challenging. Of course, there may be times when having your subject in deep shadow is exactly the effect you're looking for, so you won't need a flash or reflector, as in this example. You'll be able to see the uncropped image together with its shooting data in the final slideshow I promised you. Okay, now we come to the third issue you're going to have to deal with when shooting Contre-Jour, which is processing the image. At the beginning of this video, I talked about the huge number of images of silhouettes at sunrise and sunset I've seen on the internet, which are being used to illustrate the concept of Contre-Jour. Well, Contre-Jour silhouettes were being produced long before the craze for sunsets and sunrises, as illustrated by the work of some of the great photographers of the 20th century, like Sabine Weiss, Sebastião Salgado, Jean-Luc Sif, and Robert Doisneau, amongst others. Back in the days of film, processing an image such as this, with a total lack of detail in the shadows, was relatively simple. But in the middle of the last century, the late, great Ansel Adams took Contre-Jour photography to a whole new level when it came to processing his images. He would sometimes spend a whole day in the darkroom working on one photograph in order to squeeze detail out of seemingly impossible areas to produce a stunning image like this. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that you spend a whole day working on one image, but I am telling you that if you want to produce good Contre-Jour images, you are going to have to be prepared to spend some time in front of a computer, and that means you're going to have to shoot raw. Straight out of the camera, this image looked like this. If you're not used to shooting raw, then you should know that the image will always look flat and, well, pretty manky when you first view it. But everything you see here was available in here. All it needed was a bit of time and patience to draw it out and produce an image which reflected the scene as I saw it on that mid-October morning, looking through the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel to the Louvre Museum in Paris. Remember, I've added nothing to this photo. All that data was there, hidden away within that raw file. And then, once processed in Adobe Camera Raw, and with the image now in Photoshop, I removed that obtrusive white van in front of the iconic Louvre pyramid, corrected the horizontal and vertical perspective, played with the vibrance and saturation, et voila, a seemingly flat and uninteresting image is transformed. So now I could answer the two questions many of you will have been thinking that I've forgotten about, which is, what about white balance and what about metering? Well, as I've just demonstrated, you need to be shooting raw, therefore you don't need to worry about white balance. Simply shoot auto white balance and then alter it in post-processing if you want to. In a challenging situation, it's one less thing to think about. As for metering, I usually leave it to the camera's averaging system, which for me is Nikon's matrix. Canon call it evaluative, and on Sony cameras it's multi. Each manufacturer has a different name for it. Occasionally, I might use spot metering, but unless you know exactly how spot metering works, I suggest that you don't. Maybe that's another topic for my video to-do list. So there you have it. Shade the front element of your lens, get the exposure right, and, if shooting portraits, add some additional light. Shoot raw and spend some time post-processing. Tackle those challenges successfully, and you'll end up with some really nice attention-grabbing Contre-Jour photographs. But don't be disheartened if it doesn't come good right away. Just keep at it, and trust me, success will come with practice and experience. Okay, now before I fire up the promised slideshow, can you please do me a couple of favors? If you found this tutorial at all interesting or helpful, could you please hit the like button? If you're watching as a subscriber, then I thank you. Your interest is very much appreciated, and I promise to keep more content coming. If you're not a subscriber and you'd like to see more content from me, please hit the subscribe button now so that you don't miss any future videos. Alright then, with that small cry for help out of the way, here comes the slideshow. Ciao for now, and I look forward to the next time.